We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.
Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Free Association Radio. This is Robert Phoenix, your host, and today we have two tremendous guests lined up for your entertainment and enlightenment simultaneously. We're going to get into some ancient history, sacred history, secret history, and that'll come with the introduction of our first guest, Laird Scranton. And in the second hour, I'll be bringing my friend Richard Grossinger on, and Richard always has some very interesting, wide-ranging, and far thoughts. So we're going to get into this right now. Laird Scranton, this is just from his website. Laird basically came to me through John Anthony West, and John spoke really highly of Laird when I had John on about 3 weeks ago, and I spent some time on Laird's website and looked up some of his books and spent some time with his YouTube videos. And he's got some really fascinating things to say about the origins of mankind and cosmologies and alternate histories. And we're going to get into that. He's the author of The Science of the Dogon, Decoding the African Mystery Tradition, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, The Key to Advanced Science in the Ancient Egyptian Hieroglyphs, The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol from the Dogon in Ancient Egypt to India, Tibet, and China, and his latest book, The Velikovsky Heresies, Worlds in Collision and Ancient Catastrophes Revisited. And it's his take on the radical and maverick researcher, Immanuel Velikovsky, and we're going to get into Velikovsky's work, I think, pretty deeply here over the course of the next hour. So without further ado, let's bring him on here. This is Mr. Laird Scranton from upstate New York. Hello, Laird.
Hey, Robert. Thanks a lot for having me on. I've been looking forward to this.
It's my pleasure, and thanks for being here and being a part of this. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty well. It's a nice, crisp fall day in upstate New York. Life is good.
Good. Now, are you on a book tour or on a speaking tour currently?
No, actually, I am just back from two conferences, one in Virginia Beach and one in St. Paul, Minnesota. So those were fairly intensive weeks. But I do conferences sort of hit and miss. I do radio and television interviews and documentaries and things like that. And then I'm also involved in writing a book at the moment.
What's your next project, Laird?
Let's see, there's a book at the publisher called China's Cosmological Origins, which is the next in my series on cosmology. And the book I'm currently working on, is called Point of Origin. And what it does is it ties each of the traditions I study back to a single starting point.
So it's kind of a comprehensive sort of macro view of these different strands that you're putting together?
Yes, it's sort of a synthesis of how it is that each of these traditions turned out to be so similar, so strikingly similar and yet different.
Okay. So according to your bio, you studied English at Vassar. Wasn't that where Joseph Campbell taught?
No, Joseph Campbell wasn't at Vassar, and I was one of the early male co-eds at Vassar. Vassar had been an all-women's college, but I don't think Joseph Campbell was ever at Vassar.
Huh, interesting. So you studied English, and obviously you come from a different tradition academically. Like if we were looking at this from, a university perspective or an academician's perspective, you're an English person, and here you are in the realm of comparative mythology and catastrophism to some extent, and really trying to untangle these missing pieces, much like John Anthony West is. Are you considered kind of an interloper or a non-accredited researcher in those circles, Laird?
No, not really, because it overlaps into academia a fair amount. I have articles published in academic journals such as Anthropology News through the University of Chicago, and I have articles in Temple University's Encyclopedia of African Religion, and one of my books was taught at Colgate College for a couple of years. So I sort of straddle a line.
Right. My bad. Campbell was at Sarah Lawrence, not Vassar. I knew it was a women's college. So
yeah, those colleges. There's an association there of women's colleges that goes way back.
Right. Okay. Cool. When did you first get turned on by this whole notion of kind of alternate histories, alternate realities, and variant cosmologies? When did that really spark your interest and said, this is the direction I want to go?
Well, I really wish that I had tripped across it when I was at Vassar, because one of the important researchers who contributes information that I use in my China book was a professor at Vassar when I was there. His name was Walter Fairservice. But I didn't really come to this until much later. In the early 1990s, my wife gave me a book about ancient mysteries, and one of them touched on some knowledge the Dogon tribe had that they shouldn't have had about astronomy. And that got me started down the path of exploring this stuff. And I just kept following source that led me to additional sources that led me to additional sources.
Let's talk about the Dogon. It's your first book and seems to be kind of the cornerstone of your work in some ways. You've had 2 editions of the Dogon, and you continue to bring that forward in some of your other works. Can you give some people that listen to the show, they're really knowledgeable and they understand the Dogon and Sirius B and all that stuff. But for those that aren't, can you give kind of a brief summation as to who they were and why they're important?
Sure. They're a modern-day African tribe with about 300,000 individuals in the tribe from Mali, which is in the hump of northwestern Africa, and they live 8 hours removed from any major center of commerce. And they knew some things about science that they shouldn't have known, given the fact that they're a modern-day primitive tribe. They don't have access to telescopes. And so in particular, what they knew was that the bright star of Sirius really involves 2 stars. There's a bright star that you can see and a little dark star you can't see because it's in the glare of the bright star. And not only did they know that the second star was there, but they knew the correct orbital period for the 2 stars. And so that got me wondering how they could possibly have known that without equipment. And so when I started to research them, I discovered they were a crossroads for ancient traditions that they preserved for 5,000 years, what looked very much like ancient Egyptian traditions and ancient Egyptian words. They have rituals like Judaism, and they have a cosmology, a creation, a set of symbols and myths that look a lot like ancient Buddhism. I thought, wow, wherever this goes is going to be interesting.
That's fascinating. So are you, and I apologize, I haven't read either book, so we're sort of navigating through this together. Are you surmising in your books that the tradition from Egypt came down through Mali and into the Dogon, and that's where they accrued their knowledge of Sirius B and some of their creation myths. Is that your premise?
No, what it looks like to me is that in ancient times, some of these ancient cultures had a tradition of deliberately sending out little priestly groups to locate themselves in remote spots. There's a little Tibetan tribe up on the borderland between Tibet and China that looks like one of those, and the Dogon look like one of those to me. But the evidence that has survived in the Dogon culture makes it look as if whatever contact they had with Egypt was really early on, because they have a lot of the same words as Egypt, and they make cosmological drawings, but they don't have a written language, and written language appeared early in Egypt. They also have all the calendars that Egypt had, but they don't have the 5 intercalary days that reconcile those calendars. And those intercalary days are also thought to have appeared very early in Egypt. And so all the evidence points to relationships to pre-dynastic and to dynastic Egypt, and the Dogon have done a really good job of remembering what their symbols and their myths and their words mean and represent.
And this is all oral tradition, too, for the most part, right, with them?
Yes, and that sounds like it would be iffy, but it's not really. It's like when I'm a software guy, and when I went out on my own working for multiple companies, I thought, gee, this is going to be a lot less secure than working for one company. But the truth was, it's really quite a bit more secure. The Dogon, having no language, it turns out, in my perspective, that the cultures that did the best job of preserving their traditions intact were the ones that never developed writing, because the original system was given with mnemonic symbols. To give you an idea of how that works, my wife and I were concerned when we had small kids that they might get lost at a county fair, so we taught them to sing their address and their phone number in answer to the question, where do you live and what's your phone number? And so anyone who's heard those songs has no problem remembering our address or our phone number. And that's the way this tradition works. It's a culture where every official act you perform reinforces some aspect of their creation tradition, and it holds together really tightly.
Fascinating. One of the, perhaps the central figure in the Dogon cosmology is Nomo. He is in essence, the creator god in their cosmology. Can you talk a little bit about Nomo and perhaps some of the cross-cultural references that might show up in other cultures and other traditions that might actually resemble who or what Nomo was?
Okay. One of the tricky parts of these studies is that it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish between what references are mythic and what references are intended to be taken at face value. And the concept of the Nomo, from my perspective, is a cosmological reference, not a reference to a deity. As a matter of fact, even though the Dogon system looks a lot like the Egyptian system, they don't have deities where the Egyptians do. They have other mythical characters or symbolic aspects of their tradition. And they really only have one true god, and that's a god named Amma, who carries forward as a counterpart to Amen in Egypt. Now, one of the ways you can correlate these things back and forth and be sure that you're on track with it is that each of the Dogon terms of cosmology carry at least 2 meanings. And those meanings are logically distanced from one another so that if you know the first one, it doesn't enable you to guess the second one. And so Amma is the hidden god for the Dogon, just like Amen is the hidden god in Egypt. But the word Amma also means to grasp or to hold firm or to establish, which is also a second meaning of Amen in Egypt. And so by correlating these words based on these multiple meanings and other evidence, you can get positive relationships between things. The Nomo, for the Dogon, from my perspective, represent what they call the perfect twin pair. And it's a reference that relates to a stage of creation. Now, what the Dogon have done is they've set up a single set of symbols that simultaneously represent 3 different processes of creation. They're talking about how the universe formed, how matter formed, and how biological reproduction happens. And so any symbol is going to carry meaning in terms of all three themes of the cosmology. So in terms of the creation of matter, the nomo, for me represent the two electrons of a hydrogen atom. We're talking about the perfect twin pair that's involved in the creation of the first atom. And if we're talking about biological reproduction, they represent the first division of a fertilized egg.
That's fascinating.
So there was a book by Robert Temple called The Serious Mystery that was written before the Dogen Anthropological Study was published in English, and he had access to some pieces of it, but didn't have access to all of it. And so his interpretation, which is where this concept of the nomo as beings came out of, was published before he had access to that information. In a lot of other cultures, there are references to mythical characters that have names that sound a lot like the Dogen, but from my perspective, they're all masks for this cosmological reference.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's a great deal of twin symbology through mythology. Of course, we have Ea and Enlil, and then we also have, or Enlil and Enki rather, and then we have characters like Pokang Hoya and Poklong Hoya in the Hopi tradition. So this whole concept of the twin shows up in various cultures. Are you making sort of the leap that this is the same narrative and the same thread that's being shared throughout all these various cultural streams?
Well, yes and no. One of the things I've done, by the time I got to my third book, which was The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol, what I was trying to do in the first piece of the book was establish a set of what I consider to be signature signs of this tradition. In other words, if you see a culture that does this thing, it's almost a certain fact that they are preserving the same tradition. And I do think that the Hopi have many of the same elements that came out of the same original tradition. Part of what I was trying to do was sort of what English scholars did when they were trying to come up with definitive copies of Shakespeare's plays or definitive versions. Because back in the day when Shakespeare wrote, there were no copyright laws, and so every publisher would send an employee down to listen to the play and scribble down the lines so they could be the first ones on the street with a published version of the play. So what scholars ended up with were all these variant versions of the same play. And when it came time to producing the official versions, they had to reconcile the differences between all those variant versions. And that's sort of what I'm doing with ancient traditions, trying to get back to, it looks like these all came from the same source. What did that source look like?
Interesting. One of the people that was trying to do, I suppose, something similar, but in a much more, in some ways, radical fashion, especially against the grain of the academic standards and the academic elite of his time, is Immanuel Velikovsky, and you have a book out about his life. Did Velikovsky influence you in any way along this journey?
Well, I think maybe subconsciously. I went to high school in Portland, Oregon, which had been a seat of student support for Velikovsky back when he wrote in the 1950s, and so I had heard about Velikovsky. Velikovsky was a lifelong friend of Albert Einstein, and they worked on several projects together. And he, based on research he was doing with using ancient texts, he came to the conclusion that Venus couldn't be billions of years old as a planet. It had to be only a few thousand years old, and he wrote a book, a very controversial book in 1950 called Worlds in Collision. And one of the things I'd had in the back of my mind was to eventually take a look at the science that's been done since he wrote, and actually since he died in 1979, and try to reconcile that with what his theory says and see if we could tip the controversy one way or the other.
And based on your research, how do some of his theories actually hold up?
They actually hold up better than I was expecting they might. That if I had to characterize the whole theory, I mean, there are certain aspects of it that are not really confirmable. He talks about, he makes qualitative arguments rather than quantitative ones. And so he'll take a situation and say, if this was true, then common sense tells us that this, and this must be true. And most of those play out really very well. He's very insightful in terms of what he says must be true. But then he tries to do the same thing for chemistry, because he's suggesting that Venus roamed through the solar system for a period of time and interacted both with Mars and with the Earth. And he presents some qualitative statements about chemistry that happened that there's no way to really verify. That it's sort of problem is we don't have enough information about what the atmospheres were like and how long an interaction they had and how close an interaction they had and so forth to be able to evaluate those pieces of it. But the other pieces of his scenario, as you step through it, what I found is that at every stage of his scenario, you end up with half a dozen considerations that evaporate if Velikovsky is right, but that each half require their own special explanation if he's wrong, things that the astronomers can't explain and that they have to come up with sort of an ad hoc theory to explain. And it happens again and again and again and again. And I look at the overall picture and I say, that's not the way a theory that's flatly wrong should work. That's the way a theory that might be right works.
Interesting. One of his theories, and correct me if I'm mistaken here, is that Earth is actually a byproduct of Saturn. Is that correct?
No, that doesn't really play into his Venus theory. His Venus theory really, the pieces of it are that, as the Greek myth says, in the Greek mythology, the goddess who, from one perspective, represents Venus, was sprung from the head of Zeus, who was Jupiter. And Velikovsky is saying that Venus was ejected from Jupiter after Jupiter was struck by another body. In the myth, Jupiter swallows a goddess and then Venus is born. So he says that Venus was ejected by the gas giant Jupiter and that it started out as a comet and roamed through the solar system, and it was actually classed by ancient cultures with the sun and the moon because it was so bright. You could see it during the daytime as it moved across the sky. And these cultures all had 4-planet systems, not 5-planet systems. And so for a long time, the cultures didn't even realize it was a planet, and all of their iconography and all the words they use to describe it are given in terms of comets. And so Velikovsky says that, among other things, Venus ended up making a direct impact on Mars and changed its orbit, and then made a close near miss to the Earth around 1500 BC and caused all the eruptive situations that ended the Minoan Empire and the Old Kingdom in Egypt. And that Mars then made an approach around 750 BC that came close to the Earth that created upheaval that we can see scientifically, and that eventually Venus settled down into its regular orbit. And from that, he made some predictions about Venus that played out pretty well. He predicted, at a time when most scientists thought Venus would be colonizable back in the 1950s, Velikovsky was saying that can't be true if it's young. If it's a young planet, we're going to get there, and we're going to find that it's very hot. And we got there, and we found out that the surface was hot enough to melt lead. He said, if it's a young planet, well, Carl Sagan, who was one of his critics, said, when we get to Venus, we're going to know you're wrong because we're going to see so many impact craters like on the moon, and that's going to be proof that it had to have been around for a long time. But we got to Venus and discovered that the surface was pristine. And so when the astronomers announced that finding, they started a tradition that sort of continues to today, that at the same time they make an announcement that might support Velikovsky, they also announce a second theory that sort of distances it from him. And their theory about the pristine surface of Venus was, clearly, geological processes we don't understand have somehow globally resurfaced the planet.
Interesting. Laird, why is Mars, and maybe I'll answer this question on my own just by asking it, but why is Mars so prominent in not just our mythology, but our current theater of pop culture? Mars is the dominant planet. We're going to Mars. Mars is the place to be. We're being attacked by Mars. And Venus, in some ways, is in the shadow of Mars. And we don't spend a lot of time in terms of at least modern culture kind of mythologizing or exploring this whole notion of Venus as a presence in our solar system. Have you given this any thought at all?
Yes, part of the reason I think is because that Around 1500 BC, the cultures were so concerned about Venus that China actually invented its first system of writing in order to track where it was. All these cultures became obsessed with knowing where is Venus, and so you see all these tablets being kept of the number of days that Venus is visible and the number of days it goes out of sight, and these tablets can be compared back and forth to one another now, and none of them really agrees with our perceptions of how Venus moves. But after that, when Venus stopped being a threat and it settled down, it was considered to be one of the most beautiful planets. It's the morning and the evening star, and it's associated with all these beautiful goddesses. By the time you get to around times of the Greeks and the Romans, Venus is now primarily known for its beauty, and they've mostly forgotten about the havoc that Velikovsky says it created. And so Mars, on the other hand, according to Velikovsky, made its close approach to the Earth about 750 BC, which was much more recent. Mars is a red planet, which is a color of anger and a color of war, and all the myths report Mars as being the god of war, and so I think just Venus has better PR than Mars does.
Interesting. Well, Mars also, based on that kind of continuum, Mars would be more recent in our collective memory too. Is that right?
That's right. I mean, we have very clear memories of things that happened as recently as 750 BC, but when you get to 1500 and things start to get a little bit fuzzy. But there's all sorts of scientific evidence that things really happened. For example, I have a source book I work for on astronomy called East Asian Archaeoastronomy. And one of the things that's mentioned in this book is that every total eclipse that has happened since 709 BC, they can verify using regressive computer calculations. They can verify it to the day and the place.
Interesting.
But not a single total eclipse that happened before 709 BC in any culture has been verified to the day and the place. And the only thing what that effectively means is that we don't have a way to regressively calculate eclipses beyond that boundary of 709 BC. And the only things that should be able to interfere with that are the motions of the moon and the earth and the sun. So that's an indicator that something big happened around 709 BC. Now, another indicator is that around 750 BC or just after 750 BC, culture after culture around the planet, who for thousands of years had observed a 360-day year, suddenly changed their calendars to 365 days. And I looked and couldn't find any direct evidence of any calendar in any culture that explicitly said they had a 365-day year prior to 750 BC. I even asked John Anthony West, who is connected with Egyptian scholars who are authorities on the calendars, to just give me one single piece of evidence. I just need one that argues that Egypt had to have a 365-day year prior to 750 BC. And they came up with things, but the evidence is always ambiguous. It's always given in terms of a number of months and a number of days. But the names of the lunar months in Egypt were the same as the name of the solar calendar months, and so you can't tell which one they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the ancient cultures that use intercalary days to reconcile calendars, they were reconciling their lunar calendar to their solar calendar. But in Egypt, the scholars are saying that Egypt used their intercalary days to reconcile their 360-day solar calendar to the 360-day civic calendar to the 365-day solar calendar. So it could just as easily be the case that they were reconciling a lunar calendar of 359 days plus a leap year to a solar calendar that was 360 days.
So are you suggesting that there's some sort of orbital interruption or anomaly that takes place around 750 BC, which pushes the Earth literally 5 days back or 5 days further out from its orbit around the sun?
Yeah, I'm saying something happened. I mean, the only scenario that really seems feasible in terms of physics is that the size of the Earth's orbit increased enough to make it 5 days longer. you really wouldn't be able to mess with the rotation of the Earth, and there would be no force to speed it back up. So any argument that's based on the rotation of the Earth doesn't really hold water. But the counter argument is to say, look, calculate one eclipse day for me beyond 709 BC, and I'll believe that nothing changed. But if you can't do that, then that means none of the regressions, any researcher who tells you they can align a temple to a certain star on a certain date can't be aware of what the situation is, because we can't calculate the eclipses, and those are our endpoints. Without those, we have no idea where the stars are. We're blind.
Right. One of the more sexy theories about the nature of the universe is the electric universe, which has kind of emerged over the last decade or so.
Yes.
Are there any correlations between some of the work that Velikovsky was doing and this whole notion of the electric universe?
There are. Now, one of the things I was trying to accomplish with my book, there's some criteria I set for myself to try to keep it credible and to try to undercut easy dismissal of what I was writing by a critic. I tried to prefer sources that Velikovsky had not had access to. In other words, anything that he quoted in his book, I tried not to quote in mine. I tried to pick articles from NASA websites or astronomical studies that had been done since Velikovsky died, or sources that had no axe to grind pro or against Velikovsky. And so, as part of that process, I was also trying to lean towards traditional sources, not alternate sources. And McCanney's electric universe theory, unfortunately, is still considered fringe science, just like dark matter was considered fringe science when it first came out. However, I did quote him at one point because one of the questions is, how could Venus's orbit have possibly circularized? If it was roaming the solar system, how could it possibly have circularized into what's almost a perfect circle in the few thousand years that it had? And one possibility is, McCanney says that electrical effects that are associated with the tail of a comet, create a kind of drag that could slow it down and cause it to circularize. But even without McCanney's perspective on that, they've recently discovered, when the Venus Express probe went to Venus in recent years, they compared its calculations of the rotation of Venus to calculations that had been done by previous probes 12 years earlier or 16 years earlier, and ground measurements that had been made at the same time, and they discovered that Venus's rotation had slowed by 6 minutes. And the astronomers have no viable theory as to what force is acting on Venus to slow that rotation. So that even without McCanney, we can say clearly we're not on top of every force that is acting on Venus right now. We can't flatly say that it couldn't have circularized.
Interesting. One of Velikovsky's calling cards, perhaps his main calling card in Worlds in Collision, is to take events out of the Old Testament and ascribe some sort of planetary phenomena associated with some of those events. For instance, he suggests that there is a proto-Saturn body, and that proto-Saturn body enters into a nova state, which is actually the cause of blood, which of course shows up in a number of myths and tales across the planet. What's your take on that?
Well, I see a mixture of things happening there. Some things Velikovsky is explaining through astronomy, but many of the other effects, especially the biblical effects, he's explaining in terms of just regular geology. I mean, we know that at the time, traditional researchers associate the end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt with the eruption of the volcano Thera on the island of Santorini, that ostensibly ended the Minoan Empire, and a large number of the effects that were reported in the 10 plagues of Egypt, Velikovsky ascribes to effects of volcanic eruptions, not just of that volcano, but there were many other eruptions in the same vicinity at the same time. And so, first of all, we've got the this hugely eruptive period, one of the most eruptive periods in geological history, that we can't explain why it happened. And we have all these different volcanoes and all of their effects that are caused by ash being distributed downwind. And, for example, one of the comparisons I make is to Mount St. Helens when it erupted out on the west coast, that people who were downwind from the ash developed skin boils and skin sores. And sometimes the ash would pollute lakes and bodies of water, and so the vermin who lived around those bodies of water would leave and go out into the areas where people were. Or if the ash contains just the right combination of minerals, it can turn the body of water red to look like blood. So all of these, many of the effects that were cited in the Bible, Velikovsky assigns to the geology.
Mm-hmm. He also said that Mercury was involved in the Tower of Babel catastrophe. How did you try to reconcile that with your book?
No, I didn't. My focus was really on what was happening with Venus. I was taking sort of the approach of, if you watch these TV cop shows, you know, there's a murder committed on a certain day in a certain place with a certain kind of a weapon at a certain time. And so they bring the suspects in, and they try to sort out with the suspect, is there anything here that says absolutely you couldn't have done this? And so I took each stage of Velikovsky's scenario, and I basically vetted him as a suspect in each of those scenarios to say, is there anything here that insists that you must be wrong? And if I had found something, then I could say, well, based on that, this whole piece of your theory falls down. Right. But instead what I found was sort of like when you're playing a game of Clue and somebody proposes Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick. I look at my hand, I see I can't disprove any of those, and so I have to let that accusation pass.
Right.
So that's sort of where I am with Velikovsky, is that at each stage there was nothing in my hand that I could point to that said you must be wrong.
Well, one of the things that he did with his own life and his own work is a little bit of revision. He had a very strong belief that electromagnetism played a role in orbital mechanics, and he seemed to back off of that later on. Do you think that he is right about that electromagnetism does play a role in orbital mechanics, or was he correct in sort of retreating from that premise?
Well, Velikovsky, one of the first claims he made based on electromagnetism was that scientists should find radio waves being emitted by Jupiter, and his friend Einstein basically let that one pass. He didn't agree with it. He didn't support it, but he also didn't publicly disagree with it. But a couple of years later, some astronomers who were doing another study happened to incidentally discover radio waves emitting from Jupiter. And Einstein at that point realized that he might have been too harsh on Velikovsky's views and reportedly authorized his secretary to arrange any testing that Velikovsky wanted to have done, but do it in Einstein's name. So that little piece of it, Velikovsky was right about. Velikovsky also claimed that we would discover that there was a magnetic field on the Earth that reached out at least as far as the Moon. And a few years later, Van Allen discovered exactly that kind of magnetic field. So there's several different points in Velikovsky's outlook on electromagnetism that have actually shown themselves to be right. So I have to think that there could be more to that hasn't been discovered, and so I hold that as an open question.
Velikovsky palled around with some pretty influential people. He was friends with Einstein. He studied with Freud, or one of Freud's leading students and practitioners. And in fact, Velikovsky actually analyzed Freud's dreams. Isn't that right?
Yes, he did. Velikovsky was the first licensed psychoanalyst in Israel. And he studied under Willem Steckel, who was the famous student of Freud. And yeah, I believe that early in his career he had done some analysis of Freud's dreams. And actually his approach to even this world in collision study, his answer to why humanity doesn't remember these huge catastrophes is he proposes essentially that we're going through societal amnesia, the way a person who's been through a traumatic event goes through amnesia about that event. I mean, if you've ever been in a car accident and not able to remember the details of exactly what happened, that's the sort of thing he's proposing has happened societally to us.
Well, that makes a great deal of sense. And I think it's fascinating that Freud allowed him into his dream world, whereas he wouldn't let Jung touch it. It was like
Yes.
off limits, Carl. Maybe it has to do with the fact that he was Swiss and Catholic, but that's a whole other story. But this does bring up an interesting point, and we're kind of now moving into sort of a political realm here. Velikovsky was a rabid Zionist, and I'm wondering if you have looked into whether or not Velikovsky was trying to recreate history or alter our current versions of cosmologies to sort of fit into a more Zionist-centric view of the universe. Have you seen any indication of this?
Not really. Velikovsky and Einstein both were involved with the founding of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So they both came out of that same perspective. But Velikovsky's starting point for this Venus study was he came across a papyrus in Columbia University called the Admonitions of Ipuwer. It's a papyrus that seems to describe, it's also called the Lamentations of Ipuwer. It describes a time of upheaval in Egypt that was described by whoever wrote it in terms that were very similar to the Exodus. And so Velikovsky saw this and thought, wow, here we have documentation that might actually represent and provide a historical foundation for the Exodus from Egypt, because there's very little overt evidence to say whether it happened or whether it didn't. And so I think that one of his motivations, I think that he saw an opportunity here to present one of the first facts, and a fairly major fact, that would have supported the possibility of that happening. And yes, that would have validated the perspective that Judaism has on how things have gone historically. But I don't think that Velikovsky was trying to do that for a political reason. I think he might have been doing it more for historical reasons.
I see. Did you have any kind of assistance or help from the Velikovsky estate? I know that his daughters were very guarded and secretive about any of the other manuscripts that Velikovsky had. Did you have any contact with them, or were they supportive with what you were doing?
Well, Velikovsky's daughter was also a psychoanalyst in Princeton, and she published a book. Her name is Ruth Sharon, and she published a book called The Truth Behind the Torment. And basically, this consists of the letters that were exchanged between Velikovsky and other important people during this whole upheaval about his book. And so those letters provide a window into what was really going on, and that anybody can pick up and look at and read and understand. And I took a close look at that book for a counter perspective on Velikovsky's book as to what really had been happening. But I didn't have any direct contact with the family, although recently in the last month I've had a phone call from Velikovsky's grandson, who was also a psychoanalyst in Princeton, the son of Ruth Sharon, who had been, I guess he had attended some of Velikovsky's lectures when he was a child, his grandfather's lectures. And he had been looking on YouTube to see if there were any videos of those lectures, and he turned up interviews with me instead. And so he bought my book and read it, and then wanted to call to say that how much he liked it.
That's a great story.
Well, it's the sort of, I say to my wife, this is the sort of stuff we crackpots live for, So.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you're filling in the blanks in some ways for his grandson. That's pretty significant.
Well, he was glad to see somebody taking at least an open-minded view on what happened. And as it turns out, the evidence that I could turn up it certainly doesn't refute Velikovsky, and it could be seen to support him in a lot of cases. A lot of the information I got came off of articles on NASA websites. I was trying to look for sources that were not, were not debatable. And these articles on the NASA website go through a very extensive review process before they go up on the site. I mean, I don't know how many hands they pass through before they go up there, but these are not put up lightly. And so I would quote these things, and the ones I could download I did. Sometimes I would find multiple copies of the same article on different websites. But when my editor at Inner Traditions, or at Barron Company, went through and and started trying to double-check that the links I had given her really took her to the articles that I was quoting, what she was discovering was that many of the articles had either been all altered and the paragraph I had quoted had been removed, or the website had been taken, the article had been taken down off the website, or sometimes even had been removed from the alternate websites I knew it had been on originally. And so we had a conversation about that, and I said, look, in the pre-computer world, if someone published an article, it's fair game to quote it the moment it hits print. And no one would dispute that it's fair game to do that, as long as you quote it fairly. I said, in this case, we can't. There's nothing we can do to account for someone changing their mind about how they want an article to look or taking it down off a website. That I avow that the article looked the way that I quoted as it said the things I quoted it as saying at the time I saw it, and it's not my responsibility that they've changed the article. That responsibility is on them. As a matter of fact, there have been situations already where every version of a Kindle book has been changed without knowledge of the owner after the fact.
How does that happen?
They can access the Kindle when you turn it on, and they can update it. So anything that's electronic, we find ourselves in an age of very slippery knowledge because there's nothing that holds true. If I go back and I look at a study that was done in the 1800s, or the 1800s in particular, I can count on that because, it's been published, it's in print, it's in black and white on paper. It's something you can grasp in your hand and hold. And so a lot of times I actually prefer those sources because you get a viewpoint that is not colored by some of the political infighting that's going on between groups in modern times, and it's a perspective that can't have changed since they wrote it.
One of the things that Velikovsky gave rise to a large extent, is this whole notion of catastrophism as a discipline. And there's a number of people that came out of that tradition, and in some ways, it also gives birth and credence to alternative research, many of whom are American in origin. Do you think that the whole notion of alternative research and catastrophism and looking outside the lines, thinking outside the box, is primarily kind of an American tradition or an American sort of zeitgeist?
I was at a conference last weekend where one of the presenters said, it's a mistake to attach the word alternative to the research that people are doing. Research is research, and either what you're researching and what you're presenting makes sense and can be supported, or it isn't. And it's not a case where one group is alternative and the other one is mainstream. I've had people come up to me and say, well, how do the traditional academics, how are they responding to the books you've written? And my answer to that these days is, look, there's a whole community of authors here and researchers, and just like in the traditional scientific world, there's a range of quality of work and a range of believability of work. But this community is moving research forward on their own in parallel to the academics and really without regard to the academics. So we don't really need a traditional academic to come and put a stamp of approval on it. It's going where it's going. It's like we have our own car and we're making our own way to the venue. And so I don't even look at it in those terms anymore as being alternative or not. What I'm asking myself is, can the person who's writing support the things they're writing about?
Absolutely. Your next book is about the touches on China, and one of the things I wanted to ask you is there's this strange kind of anomaly that shows up in China where there are the mummified remains of what looks like tall Zoid people, wrapped in linen, and seemingly to be older than any kind of contact that the West would have had with China. Have you looked into this at all? And if so, how does that change China's own history and how we view China?
Well, we have anomalies like that pretty much everywhere. I know that they have yet to find any preserved body in North America that's more than 4,000 years old that isn't Caucasoid. So our history and our studies and so forth are suggesting that people in North America came from Asia, but every single body they've turned up that's 4,000 years old or older does not have Asian features. It has Caucasian features. So that's an anomaly. You go to Peru and you find, misshapen skulls. You go almost anywhere and you find remains of people who seem to have been much taller than your average human is today. And so you find these kinds of anomalies everywhere, and to me they all fall into a category of what I call open questions. As I've been going through my studies, there are large pieces of what I was researching that I simply didn't understand at the time I was looking at it. I was recently reading a study of a cult from India, and the guy who wrote it was very true to his sources and very careful to report every little piece of information, even when he himself said, I don't understand why this is so, but this is how it looks. And that's sort of what you have to do with this stuff is you say, yes, I understand that this exists, but it's not a question that I'm equipped to really answer yet.
Mm-hmm. That brings up another point. There's this sort of mystery that surrounds the Olmec in central Mexico, and the remains of the Olmec are the statuary clearly resembles people or individuals that are not necessarily associated with that part of the world. In fact, they look like they might have been from Africa, and it's given rise to this whole notion or theory that the Moors traveled everywhere and that they were in Central America, that they were in places like the northern Japan, and are related to the Ainu. So there's this whole other kind of Afrocentric version of this cosmology. Have you looked into this at all? And does it hold any sort of water? Does it contain any gravity?
I think there's something to it. My research sort of has been moving geographically. I've gone from Africa to Egypt to India to Tibet to China, and the China book crosses over a little bit into North America, but I haven't really gotten into focusing on cultures in the Americas yet. But yes, the carvings that are done, the Olmec carvings look like they're representing African features to me. But we have, again, anomalies everywhere. We have things that look Egyptian in Australia that shouldn't be, that are very, very old. And we have things in Easter Island that look like things from Turkey. And we've got pyramids in Ohio. I mean, clearly there are things going on here that we don't understand. And so all you can do is keep an open mind to it and say, there's stuff going on we can't explain. If there's one thing I learned over the course of my studies, it's that there's stuff going on we can't explain. One outlook I have on traditional science is if you imagine that you're sitting in your car and you decide to make the rule for yourself that the only things you're going to consider to be real are the things you can see in your mirrors. Now, for me, this is sort of what traditional science has done. They've declared that the only things they're going to consider real are the things that they can pin down in certain ways. Mm-hmm. Now, we know, sitting in the car, that you can hide a tractor trailer in the blind spot that exists in your average car. My feeling is we've got similar sorts of blind spots for science that they're going to have to learn how to accommodate. Anybody who's paying attention realizes that there are things going on that we don't understand yet. That birds have ways of perceiving electromagnetics that we don't have. If you've ever seen a flock of birds flying together and how they dip and turn and swoop and move as a group, clearly there's something going on there besides just the luck of not bumping into each other.
I've often wondered that myself. It's like, and how they're able to move like they're of one mind or one wing. It's a fascinating thing to watch and comprehend. It's like, how are they all doing this simultaneously, right?
Yes, then you have a pair of conjoined twins, I think in Ohio also, called Abby and Brittany, who are basically these two separate people connected, and each controls half of the body. And they've learned to do just amazing things with each other as if they were a single entity, when it's clear that their brains each control, one of them moves the right hand, one moves the left hand, and right leg and left leg, but they're able to run and ride bikes and drive cars and play volleyball and do all sorts of things that you would think the two people would have a very hard time coordinating. So there's something going on with intelligence and intellect and mental communication that we don't understand.
Well, this has been a great hour of conversation with you, Laird. And before we go, I just want to ask you one more question, and it's kind of a big question. A, do you think that there's a Rosetta Stone out there that would somehow connect a lot of these really mysterious and anomalous pieces? And the other question is do you think somewhere down the line in your work, and this might be a part of your aspiration, that you could put together somehow a unifying theme as to what's happened and create a much bigger piece based on all these little pieces of the puzzle that you've been working on sort of individually?
Well, yes, I think that's true. That's what the book I'm working on pretty much does. One of the difficulties when I was working on the China book is that events and things that happened at 3000 BC didn't get written down until 300 BC in China. And so you have this enormous span of time where there are no written records, and so the academics are all on each other's backs about interpretation and so forth, because there's nothing you can point to anchor any interpretation. So for my book, I had to try to come up with ways without written texts to be able to determine what might be what. So when we take all the ancient traditions I've been studying, the Egyptians and the Buddhists and the Hindus and the Vedics and the Taoists and so forth, and try to pull this back together, it looks like whatever point of commonality they have goes way, way, way back. I mean, thousands and thousands of years before the appearance of writing. And so what I've had to try to do is come up with other methods of demonstrating what's likely to be true. And that evidence makes me think, along with DNA evidence and linguistic evidence and so forth, makes me think that we have a common point of origin for at least the traditions I'm studying. And the signature elements of that tradition keep popping up in other areas of the world, so I'd have to think they're all connected. I mean, some of these are so off-the-wall references that no culture would just make this up. It can't be coincidental that every culture associates a wheel or a chariot with Orion, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason to. You look up at Orion, there's nothing there to make you think of a chariot or a wheel.
Right.
But they all do it. And any culture that does it, I know that that's a remnant of my tradition. Any culture that had the cubit, I know is a remnant of my tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And now sometimes trying to pull those together is tricky. I'll give you an example. For the Dogon, matter is woven by a spider in the form of a web, and the spider's name means mother.
Mm-hmm.
In Egypt, matter is woven by a mother goddess named Neith, and it's woven on a loom with a shuttle. Now, how do you connect those two? They're the same basic concept, but they're not the same. Then you go to Buddhism and you discover that matter is woven by a spider whose name means mother in the form of a web, but as if on a loom with a shuttle. And so if you follow it far enough and you follow enough different traditions, you find the remnant of the piece that's the umbrella over the other references, and now you understand that they started out as one thing.
Right. And of course, in the Hopi, we have grandmother spider as well.
Right. And all these mother goddesses that are associated with spiders, like Athena in Greece and things like that, these are indicators that we've tapped into a remnant of the same tradition. And what I've been doing is trying to follow up with those references. When I studied China, I discovered that they had fairly complete pictures of certain things that I considered to be loose ends in the other traditions I study.
Well, Laird, I wish you all the best in pulling us all together, and look forward to your next book, which hopefully will provide people with a lot of answers and probably a few more questions as well.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure it'll produce more questions than answers.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'd like to have you back on when that occurs, and look forward to that time.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate being on your show.
Okay. Take care, Laird, and enjoy that wonderful fall day in upstate New York.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That's Laird Scranton, and you can find him at lairdscranton.com. And if you're interested in his work, there are 4 books there available for you. And, of course, he's working on a 5th, which is hopefully going to tie all of this together. Why don't we play a little music while we're waiting for Richard Grossinger to join us? So, to you, how about Alma Desnuda, Great Big Water? We're talking about catastrophe, cataclysm, creation myths, and we can't talk about it without water. Here's Great Big Water by Alma Desnuda. And we'll be back with Richard Grossinger in about 5 minutes.
I used to stump around and I'd wonder why, questioning the moon, the stars, the sky. And then I saw the truth, all this pain was just in my head. I thought I better stop living, 'cause soon I just might be dead. And oh, a great big water flooded me. I became just another drop in the big gigantic sea. And through all this pain, confusion, I did sift. And my soul felt louder, so I thought I'd write this funky ass riff. The next step, oh well, I took it logically, was to share my thoughts, my life philosophy. But not all of the people wanted me to speak. They wanted the safety and the comfort of their negativity. And then I read the words of Mr. Gandhi. Change in the world you want to see. And so I closed my mouth and I tried to live the truth. It's always a whole lot harder than preaching from a preacher's booth. Oh, a great big water flooded me. True, it might be drops, but ripple to infinity. And if ever you should forget this and start the trip, just listen to this message while we drop our funky riff. Listen to this message while we drop our funky riff. Listen to this message while we drop our funky riff. Listen to this message while we drop our funky riff.
That was Alma Desnuda singing Great Big Water. Speaking of Great Big Water, apparently there's just been an earthquake in Japan, off the coast of Japan, off the coast of course, Fukushima, and it's not an insignificant earthquake. It's a 7.3, and that happened about 3 minutes ago. I've just got the word here. Let me read this to you. Tokyo AP. An earthquake of magnitude 7.3 struck Saturday morning off Japan's east coast near the crippled Fukushima nuclear site. The U.S. Geological Survey said Japan's emergency agencies declared a tsunami warning for the area. The quake hit at 3:10 a.m. Saturday Tokyo time, the USGS said. The tremor was felt in Tokyo, 800 miles away. Japan's meteorological agency raised the tsunami warning for the area of Honshu, but the U.S. Pacific Tsunami Warning Center did not post warnings for the rest of the Pacific. So we are in some pretty dangerous waters here, pun slightly intended. The crippled Fukushima reactor has been thrown off intense amounts of radiation and dumping huge amounts of cesium-filled water into the Pacific, and there's nothing good about this. So we're going to have to just pay attention and see where this goes and how it unfolds. There are a lot of people that claim that the West Coast is, and has been for a while, and I'm kind of in that camp, to be honest with you. I've stopped eating fish from the Pacific Ocean, and I stopped about 2 years ago. And I won't eat any goldfish either. So let's bring Richard on. This is my good friend, Richard Grossinger. He's the author of over 30 books, including his latest series, Dark Pool, which is kind of a magnum opus of consciousness. And Richard is one of the great minds of the 20th century. And my thoughts around Richard are about 20 years from now, maybe 20, 25 years from now, there'll be a Daniel Pinchbeck-like character who will uncover Richard's works. And then Richard, at some point in time in the future, will be recognized for the contributions he's made towards the research in herbs, herbal medicine, the body, and consciousness in general. So let's bring him on right now. Here's my good friend, Richard Grossinger. Hi, Richard.
Thanks. Hi, thanks, Robert. I think we met back in was it the late 90s already, that long ago, and we were not set up to have a good connection, and yet we had a great connection right from the beginning. I don't know if it's worth going into the circumstances, but needless to say, I was set up when we met. I was lined up to confront Robert about something, and I went to see this guy who I didn't know, and ended up thinking, this is like one of the most wonderful people I've ever met. I don't want to confront him about anything. And we've been talking ever since.
So the backstory is that I was working with this magazine, and I would use the term loosely in some ways.
Very loosely, yeah. And I'd use the word magazine loosely too.
Probably even looser than working. In the magazine, Mondo 2000 had actually a great reputation, and it was riding on the fumes of the reputation, and was in a kind of a crisis state and needed a new place to set up shop. And that place happened to be a warehouse that Richard was housing quite a few books from his publishing company, North Atlantic, at. And at that point in time, I was kind of between worlds, and I was working with the magazine and trying to figure out if this was something that could be salvaged, and pretty much was living in my van with my dog. And I spent a few nights at the office, and I thought, maybe this could actually work out. And of course, Richard was he was the person that was running the show at the warehouse, and I immediately got thrust into his field of perception and make a decision as to whether or not, I was actually able to stay there, and B, if I was a fit. And clearly he was able to do that. And Richard, I think we're going on what? This is 1997, so we're talking 17 years now, right?
Yeah. In the way that time just, I don't even want to use any cliche about it anymore. Time just, does what it does. But yeah, and when Robert asked me what we might talk about, I kind of spontaneously said, let's talk about conspiracy theories and synchronicity, because I thought that was an area, a meeting point for us, a place that didn't exactly match up with the sweet spot of what I did, but that was an area in which we've had a lot of back and forth over the years. And I've been rethinking it recently because my project has been rewriting an old book of mine from the 1980s called The Night Sky, which ends up bringing up two very obvious kind of borderline events, maybe three or four actually if you break them down: UFOs, cattle mutilations, crop circles, and alien abductions. But aside from that, it crosses paths with the whole of astrology, which is one big massive synchronicity net. And also in the way that I steered through this, I encountered 9/11 again, and began kind of trying to sift through not so much even conspiracy theories about it as the different layers of subtext and meanings that have been piled on top of these conspiracy theories. And I thought, well, it could be like a conversation that Mr. Phoenix and I would have anyway, that we might try and have on the show. So that was, anyway, my thought. Whether that'll play out or not, I can't say, but I think we'll give it a try, right?
Well, absolutely. And, I think 9/11 is the white elephant in the room. And clearly, and this is interesting, Richard, because I had a conversation yesterday with, I wouldn't call him a mutual friend, but it's somebody that we know together, an acquaintance. He actually went to school with your son, and he was in the publishing business, and we you know what I'm talking. We kind of congregated.
I remember him. Yeah.
Yeah. So we got into a bit of a rift, a slight rift with each other yesterday on Facebook, and it was around this whole notion of conspiracy theory, and he was rejecting it, kind of summarily and outright to some extent. Like he was able to embrace what he could embrace without it completely rupturing his worldview, and I think that's kind of what people do sometimes. They may instead of doing a whole tab of acid, they may just nibble off a little corner so that they can have their perception altered, or they may have one or two mushrooms, but they may not take the copious amounts that McKenna would. And one of the things that came up was this whole thing around 9/11, and for him, his kind of piece around this, to me, in some ways sums it up. He says that he thinks that the government had some hand in 9/11, although he can't be sure how much or who, although he did clearly raise his hand at the mention of the name Dick Cheney, the Dick Cheney key player. He also believes that they pulled Building 7 because of financial, and it had nothing to do with the event itself. He saw Building 7 as being something completely different. And he summarily rejected that anybody on the neocon front, as they're connected to the nation-state of Israel had anything to do with it, because that would be an affront to his own religion and his own upbringing, his own culture. So here we have these kind of Rubicons, right, that, he was able to cross. There's one here he can kind of cross. There's another here he'll cross, but he'll cross with some kind of, I don't know, so some kind of sense that this may be the truth, but a disclaimer. He'll cross it with a sort of disclaimer. And then there's the Rubicon that he'll never cross. And I think in some ways, if people go through the whole 9/11, they'll have their own version of this. But I think personally, Richard, that this is a major event. It's a ritual theater. It's deeply esoteric. I do think that
right.
It has,
I mean the esotericness, and I don't mean to make anything more of this than just literally what it is. But have you ever seen a more perfect tarot card drawn than the Tower on that day?
Absolutely not.
I mean, to talk about a tarot card drawn at large out of an unseen deck.
Absolutely not. And Richard, here's the ironic part. Most of the solid remains of the quote-unquote Twin Towers, right? And there weren't a lot of solid remains. Ones that do remain, they're at Hangar 17 at JFK Airport, which is important. And the company that last owned that hangar was Tower Air. That's where the remains are for the Twin Towers.
Uh-huh. Well, that that gives me a segue to kind of what I wanted to say when you started speaking, which is that my last little 9/11 boost was back in early September when my wife and I visited Alex and Allison Gray at their new center along the Hudson, Chapel of Sacred Mirrors. You know Alex Gray, the sacred painter, visionary painter, and also just general visionary. And he gave me a copy of his newest book, in which there are several pages devoted to remembering 9/11 before it happened. And I don't know if you know about this, that there are two key record album jackets that show 9/11 to show an image incredibly similar to 9/11 before it happened, the planes, the towers, the explosions. But there also are a lot of other little pieces of things, including a painting by Alex, I think almost 10 years before it, or more than 10 years, of two planes and the Twin Towers, and a figure that if you weren't told that he had never heard of George Bush at the time he painted it, you would have said was George Bush. And yet he painted this, I think, in 1988. And then, most remarkable of all, was the one artist with a studio in the Twin Towers and who died that day was this guy, Michael Richards. And afterwards, it was realized that he had a self-portrait in a museum in North Carolina, a sculpture, a metal sculpture of himself with numerous tiny planes embedded in his body, as if kind of crashing into him like the Tar Baby. And I read quickly what Alex said about this, and I said, so what's your view? Are we talking about synchronicity at a cosmic level or a conspiracy theory at a secular kind of secret government level? And what he said, I think, is like a stepping stone to the next view, which is, well, at that level, it's both. And I've thought about that since, because you can say that rather facilely, but you then have to really ponder what the implications are. And I'm reminded, too, of the famous random number generator at Princeton University that that abandoned its white noise and began generating significant patterns 3 hours before 9/11, and went right through the event. So I am left with a bunch of pieces that don't fit. because and I think they don't fit because they're part of a larger embedding into the universe, and we can't see it. And the way in which they don't fit, though, is exactly the same way in which an astrological chart ends up having uncanny information about a person's life, or in the way that there's not really any explanation for the cattle mutilations, and there's the crop circles clearly, I mean, so clearly it's almost absurd to consider it, were not made by Doug and Dave or any hoaxers. The majority of them represent an unknown mechanism. And even if you want to say that they're hoaxes, who knows how to, I mean, in just the world as we know it, who knows how to program fractal designs that land in grasses and grains at a distance using balls of light? That technology's never been revealed. So if they're not extraterrestrial, they're local alien events. And so that's just that's a kind of zigzag course over a number of different things that I'm tying together while sort of trying to also make the point that they can't exactly be tied together. So let me bounce it back to you, though, before taking it any further.
Well, I think, Alex's answer, I think, is spot on, because I think it's both. I think we are dealing with a terrestrial or secular conspiracy, and I think it is also a cosmic or esoteric conspiracy as well. I mean, one of the albums that you mentioned is an album by a group called The Coup. Interesting name, right? The Coup. Yeah. And they happen to be from Oakland, and the name of the record is Parte Music, and it shows Boots Riley and Pam the Funkstress, who are the core members of The Coup, very good band, but it shows them with a device, and that device is in their hands, and they're right below the World Trade Center, and they're exploding the World Trade Center. And this happens prior to 9/11. Now, I really don't think that somebody brought Boots Riley and Pam the Funkstress into a room and gave them a diet soda and said, hey, look, this is what's going to happen. We want you guys to put this on your album cover. I don't think it happened.
Right. Yeah, and so when we raise this whole topic, one of the things that is in there somewhere, and maybe more than one level, is the notion of unconscious information traveling telepathically. And if you asked me 20 years ago if I thought that was possible or likely, I would have, if I really had to call it, I would have said, well, maybe not. And 10 years ago, I would have sat on the fence. And now I think that that's most likely the way the universe is structured, and that it is not just a matter of people getting information on a conscious level telepathically. I feel as though we're linked to this vast network of unconscious information that's not just flowing through the species or the planet, that is probably flowing through the galaxy, the super galaxy, the universe, and that would include other dimensions of beings. And so, I mean, that's an easy thing to say. I mean, anybody can make that statement. There's no requirement to back it up. And I say that I kind of say that I've come around to feeling that that's likely, I mean, partly through writing this 3-volume book on consciousness, I hit upon a lot of these ideas and talked to a number of people who are ahead of me in their own training and personal development, and I came to the sense that that actually the more a person trains their perception, the more they become aware of the presence and support of other consciousnesses and other entities. And I maybe have the faintest apprehension of that, but it's an actual apprehension. It's not an idea. It's something that's stable and stays with me. So I come back to thinking, to go back to your specific image, that at a time you create an intense vortex, and maybe that group, the coup, created an intense vortex, like these blobs of information come through at an unconscious level that are like anachronistic and prochronistic. They don't. They're outside of time, so they come in. Doesn't matter if they've already happened, if they happened somewhere else, or they happened back in the Stone Age, or if they've yet to happen. They're flowing through this field which is outside of time, and maybe that's not the best language for it, but it points through a glass darkly to something for which there probably is a better language.
Well, what I think is interesting, and maybe you might remember this, and you can kind of correct me or course correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe that James Joyce's daughter was a patient of Carl Jung's, and she actually had a vision of an ocean liner that went down. It happened, but Joyce's daughter was borderline schizophrenic, which is why I think she was seeing Jung, and he was trying to make this sort of connection between what he did with his art and what she did with her sort of precognitive vision. And Jung was trying to kind of steer him off the course and saying, well, yes, but you're an artist, and and she is, for lack of a better term, mad. And yet she was able to tune into this event before it happened. Do you know that story?
Sounds a little familiar. I'm not currently up on it. I haven't really checked it out lately, but it isn't totally unfamiliar. And but it falls into a class of stories. And probably everyone who's alive, whether they believe in this kind of stuff or not, can tell you at least one off the charts incident in their life. And usually it's ascribed to coincidence or chance or the stop clock that's right twice a day kind of thing. But I don't think that that human beings and certainly not scientists have either the equipment or perhaps the neural frequency and cognitive capacity to really grok what the universe is doing. So whereas as having a legitimate place, I don't think it has any more of a legitimate place than the notion that we're looking at something much, much larger than we can conceive of, something that's incomprehensible to us, and then we get little pieces of how it's connected up. And so we have these stories, like take the one, the James Joyce's daughter and the ocean liner story. We don't know enough about how the brain operates, how information is constructed, to even begin to analyze what could have been happening. In fact, in the trilogy on consciousness, Dark Pool of Light, I worked through a lot of neuroscience and biology and physics and psychology, and finally came to a very simple conclusion, which is that the big issue for science is not so much that they don't understand a lot about consciousness. They understand a great deal about consciousness and its nature and how it works. What they don't know is what it is and how it gets inside matter. And that's a big thing not to know about something that you're investigating, to not know what it is and how it gets inside molecules, inside things made of molecules. And they have cover stories for it. They have things that sound almost like explanations, but I can say with pretty good assurance that none of them is worth its own salt. They're just that. They're cover stories.
Cover stories. Yeah, life is kind of a cover story in general, isn't it?
Yeah, Shakespeare said that.
Yeah.
Or a few plays.
One of the things that I came to understand about my research into 9/11, I've spent a lot of time looking at 9/11, and there is a theory, which seems to be more than just a theory, that both of those towers were built to be taken down at some point in time. Now, whether it was sort of planned obsolescence, and it's New York, and they're going to eradicate them at some point because that's just the nature of a city or the soul of a city, or whether it was planned that these towers would be part of an act or an operation that would be much more than just the leveling of them when the time came, that would be symbolic. Because when you actually look, there are pictures that I've seen that are really, sort of jaw-dropping, where the sun, this is when the Twin Towers were really, quote-unquote, the Twin Towers. And you have the sun shining through the Twin Towers, and you see, and this is right around, I believe, I think it's sun is rising, so this is early in the morning. And you can see through the Twin Towers, there's this kind of amber light. And you look at them, it's shining right through, and for the most part, they're hollow. I mean, there are floors, you can see the ribs of the floors, but then there's light pouring through vast amounts of open space in those buildings. And one of the theories is that, the majority of those floors were not occupied, and that they were actually hollow. So in doing that, this is really just an edifice in a lot of ways of New York to have this kind of grand accomplishment with these Twin Towers, which represent Boaz and Jacob, if you want to go to the esoteric tip. But also, it was a facade. It was a story in and of itself. And so when it came time to take them down, it was a lot easier because there weren't a lot of supporting structures inside the buildings themselves. So you have, on one hand, this idea that they were permeable and they were ephemeral. They were going to be taken down, and that was part of the planning. So that idea is actually embedded in the architecture of the buildings themselves. So that idea is stone. And then you have this other idea that it would be at some point this symbolic act, or an esoteric act, and perhaps even third, a geopolitical act. So you have these kind of parallel rifts, going on with the towers themselves, just by their own architecture and their own structure.
Right, and what I would continue to point out is that these pieces don't go together. They don't go together in an ordinary sense. So if each of them has a certain intrinsic validity, there's a bigger picture that we can't see. And it's not that we can't see it because, we don't, it's secret, We can't see it because we don't operate at that frequency. We don't see anything of that sort. And with something like 9/11, we can see pieces of it. I've come to believe, I thought this back, there's an older book of mine called The Bardo of Waking Life, in which I wrote about those two famous 9/11 theories that they called lie hop and lie hop, which I thought was kind of funny because they contain the house of pancakes in them. You know, the
International House of Pancakes, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, International House of Pancakes. Did you ever hear about those two theories? The lie hop was let it happen on purpose, and lie hop was made it happen on purpose. And actually, at the time, I kind of took a third position, which was, and I've come back around to kind of thinking that this is true. Well, no, that's awfully simple to say. I don't mean think it's true, just reconsidering it, which is just that it's the more conventional thing, that neither did they let it happen on purpose or make it happen on purpose, that once it happened, they took total advantage of it. Now, that's indisputable. Well, it's as close to indisputable as you can get. So then it brings up the question of, did somebody else other than just Osama bin Laden and his group make it happen? And I think possibly so. I mean, that's its own whole investigation. But I'm simply trying to say that I don't think that Bush and Cheney, and really it's Cheney we're talking about here, I don't think that they're at the level to pull that off. Cheney's been in the news a lot lately, and I think, like so many people, I listen to him very carefully for the subtext because he says absolutely nothing. So you have to really listen closely for the betrayed subtext. And I think that that in his case, the subtext I read indicate not a mastermind, but somebody who's in the hands of a mastermind. And so then that points to the so-called secret government, which seems to me a lot more likely. However you want to construe the makeup of that secret government, and either include or not include aliens, that seems a much more likely active conspiracy than it does to me that Cheney just did it. I just think he got lucky. He was in the right place at the right time, at least for his ambitions. But
so,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I know somebody who was doing a fair amount of work with Neil Bush right around that time, and this is what he claims. He claims that the Bush administration was basically going to do Shanksville. That was the operation, and then it control. Then it veered. And when Bush finds out about this, in the classroom down in Florida, reading that book about the goat, he at that point becomes terrified. And he actually, if you follow his journey at that point, he goes into hiding. He runs because and it's my friend's assertion that he was afraid for his life, that this went rogue. This whole thing went rogue. And the two other events around the Pentagon and the Twin Towers were not part of the script. It was, they planned that out. Now all of a sudden they've got three events out. Yeah.
I don't know that I buy it completely, but it gets my interest, and it also interestingly tracks along some of the new JFK assassination conspiracy stories that you may have heard. That Lyndon Johnson was not the architect of the assassination, but he was the beneficiary, and not just the beneficiary, but he was intended by other folks to be the beneficiary, because this is not me talking. This is stuff that's come to me. It's been around the internet and on the air, that he was going to dump Johnson in the next election as vice president and go in a different direction, and that the powers, the greater powers, decided they didn't want that. But that leads me, actually, because I don't want to get too wound up in this, to tell you a brief little story. I go back and forth between living in Berkeley and living in Down East Maine these days, and Down East Maine is where, as a graduate student in the late 60s, I did a PhD in anthropology on fishermen, lobster fishermen mainly. And the main guy I worked with, Wendell Seavey, turned out it had nothing to do with my study, and I learned this years later as we became friends. He's an amazing psychic and has had many extraordinary experiences that are completely authentic. And when you talk to this guy, he's about one of the most down-to-earth people you've ever met, and he's integrated his psychic capacities into his whole kind of working class persona. And I could tell many very convincing stories about him, one of which is that he speaks with an accent that it sounds like a kind of extreme Maine accent, but it's not a Maine accent at all. It's a very obscure rural British accent that nobody else in Maine speaks with, and that he was basically started speaking in that accent from his first words. And so where did that come from? But anyway, we went for a walk the other day, and because it was approaching the JFK assassination, he told me that he and his father were out to sea that day, and they were in an area of ocean about 8 to 10 miles offshore. There was nobody around them. The sea was calm. And at the exact moment that they later found out about that the assassination took place, they heard 3 loud shots. And he said to his father, "What was that?" And his father said, "I haven't the slightest idea." And then when they got back into the wharf, they were told, and his father, who was not inclined to metaphysics, just said to him, "That's what we heard. That's what we heard out there." And Wendell said to me, he had no doubt, knowing his father and who he was, that he meant it. And I've told that story to a few people, and it almost becomes a litmus test of where people are, because they'll say, "Well, how could he have heard them? The assassination was in Texas. It wasn't out in the North Atlantic, so how could he have heard them?" And then the obvious answer is, well, he heard them psychically. But that again, as I've said about other things, is facile. You can just say it. But I'm interested, and this is what I kind of do in my work, is find things like this, make facile assumptions, and then look for ways to tie them into something more substantial. And I found myself in a conversation with someone else sort of asking the question, it's just a question, but would a gull have heard it? And I don't have an answer. I just wonder, when you say psychic, does that mean on a wavelength that human beings, for being part of the society, can hear, or is it something that kind of ricochets through all of consciousness at some level? If it does ricochet through all of consciousness, does it ricochet as the same thing through all of consciousness, so that you would have to be an American or a human being to hear it as shots, and if you were a gull, you may have heard it as something completely different based on your biology and your state of consciousness. I sometimes say this about my work when people ask me what my work is about. I'm not a question answerer. I'm more a raiser of questions and somebody who looks for kind of mysteries and borderline events that cry out for a little more inquiry. So that's my little departure there, and you can, I want to hit the ball back to you now.
Well, I met Wendell. Do you remember you introduced?
Oh, that's right, I did. Yeah, you were in one of the more ill-fated episodes of the Robert Phoenix Odyssey. I don't know if I'm allowed to reveal that on the air.
You can reveal it. It's okay.
Oh, well, my memory of it was that, and I think this is slight hyperbole, but that you met somebody at a party and said, let's go to Las Vegas, or she said, let's go to Las Vegas and get married. And, or soon after you went to Las Vegas and got married. And then you found yourself married to this person and wondered, who she was. And she said, well, I've got parents, I think in Worcester, Massachusetts. And so off you were to meet them. And I was in Maine and said, why don't you come up here? There's a guy here who kind of is your doppelganger in a funny way. And he just met somebody and got married rather suddenly, which added up to the synchronicity doppelganger kind of notion. So you made a little side trip up to Maine and stayed a night or maybe two, and I guess must have met Wendell in the course of that.
That's right.
So that's my version, my mythology of your life, which you, for better or worse, don't get to make a mythology out of. You have to live it, and so you're now in Austin coaching your son's Little League games that really follow from that event, because that's the fact that you even have a son.
That's correct. Absolutely. It wouldn't have taken place without sort of rolling the dice in Las Vegas, so to speak.
Yeah. But
yep.
I make the argument, too, while I'm at this, that doesn't... What's your son's name again?
Griffin.
Griffin, right, Griffin. My argument is that Griffin already existed, but that he wouldn't have been necessarily your son or your son in that way. That's my feeling, and I particularly about a child. He's now a teenager on Mount Desert here where I am. Woofy, whose father died on a vision quest back in 2002 or 2003, and who we published a book by called The Chakra System of Mount Desert Island back then, and he became Woofy's father through having a relatively brief marriage to a wonderful woman here who's a lawyer for the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. And I had the distinct sense in his account of it that the whole event was set up, and that's what Chris came to believe, for Woofy, who had been an Indian chief in a previous lifetime, to come into this world, or an Indian shaman, I guess. And I think as a boy, Woofy was amused by that story. I don't know him directly anymore, but when I see him as like a tall MDI high basketball player, I bet he's not much thinking about that Indian shaman anymore.
Right.
And but I do think that to try and summarize the impossible, that we do serve higher purposes and serve other agencies, and while we think we're going about our free will events.
Absolutely. To ask you a question, and it has to do with the manipulation of consciousness, or the manipulation of matter, or the manipulation of magic. And people like David Icke, Michael Saran, they're even myself to some extent have a theory that there are people that actually tap into the kind of vector, the kind of world that you and I are talking about. And as a result of that, what they attempt to do is they attempt to use the energy from that world through symbolism, through ritual, either incantation or ritual, to continue to run a program in this reality, in this domain, that is allowing them to continue to, sort of control our lives through this application of magic or magical technology. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm pretty amused by Ike. Is that how you say his name? I'm pretty amused by him. I think he creates great mythologies and metaphors for something else, and I don't mean that as a put down. The first thing I thought when you said that was, I myself am more interested in the fact that everyone at a kind of low level does this to everyone else, that we're in total psychic collusion with each other, trying to kind of manipulate and bump and in other ways try and change other people or kind of enter into their conscious symbol flow. But I don't think that this is something. I think this is something that is not just done unconsciously. It's only done unconsciously, and that when we try and do it consciously, that it doesn't work. So I would put the other stuff. Well, some of the other stuff that you're talking about a very complex net of symbols and energies. And I think that that's also unquestionable, that at some level that is happening. And that, at very least, Madison Avenue practices that. The advertising agencies practice that, and sometimes very effectively. But I also think that you're loosely, or maybe not even loosely, but kind of pointing towards psychotronics. That is the combination of psychological warfare and manipulation with electronics, whereby, and a lot of the UFO and alien abduction stuff is wrapped around psychotronic tropes, and I think, that there's plenty of circumstantial evidence that governments, especially the old Soviet Union and I'm sure New Russia and the United States military, engage in psychotronics of one sort or another, or at least try and figure out what you can get away with. And all you need to know to find credible the fact that they do these things is that Russell Targ worked for the Pentagon doing remote viewing on salary and training military people how to do it. So you know that they're in the game, that they're aware of the game and that they're in it. And a good military man is not going to join the Skeptics Association because he or she only wants to know what works. And they don't care if it's permitted by the amazing Randy, or the not so amazing Randy. They only want to know what works because that's the game they're in. And if the other guys are using psychotronics and getting results, they don't care if they're not supposed to get results or if it's breaking a taboo or if they're violating the rules of TED, which is now outlawing all non-local consciousness as part of science. They just want to know what works. So, I've meandered away from your question, but I think all three things are in play. I think that the unconscious collaboration of all of us together in transfers of psychic energy and information is happening. I think that the creative generation of mixtures of energy and symbol webs are happening, and I also think that certain constabularies are trying to develop or have developed some form of psychotronic technology.
I would agree with you, and one of the things I love about you, Richard, is how you're able to straddle not just two worlds but three worlds sort of simultaneously, and you have kind of an open space architecture in your consciousness that allows you to do that, and you can be both a witness and you can also be a reporter or a commentator on that experience. I don't know too many actually hold that, because one of the things that I think we struggle with trying to understand the nature of reality and these events is this whole idea of polarization and having a position. And once we get to a position and we polarize, then we're, in a lot of ways, taking part in the act itself. That we're acknowledging the other and we're acknowledging the reality of the other. And so it's a really fascinating kind of stance or a space to hold in order to have it big enough or expansive enough to see all these things in play. And that's one of the things I've always appreciated about you, Richard.
Well, thank you. I mean, when you were saying that, I was kind of thinking about it as a accolade or something, and I was just kind of laughing, since I'm in the place where I did anthropology fieldwork in the late 60s as a graduate student, about how unamused my professors were back then about how I thought or tried to think, and how much kind of false trails and practice it took to achieve, a mindset that I was comfortable with. And back then, I was merely practicing different modes and certainly driving academics crazy, because I was 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and they couldn't completely kick me out, but they certainly couldn't welcome me in. And that's sort of been the case all the way along, which is why it's good I stopped teaching college. I stopped teaching a long time ago, in 1977, and ran the publishing company instead, because that was a more suitable profession for somebody who was going to try and do that, be kind of witness and participant at the same time. So yeah, thank you.
No, you're welcome. And I just, and I say that because it's not an easy thing to do. And I think it's in some ways a kind of a very important practice. So, hey, Richard.
Yeah, my favorite, are you finishing? I'll just say as a final clue to leave off, my favorite recent kind of terminology is Robert Sardello, the Jungian's reworking of Jung's concept of the psychoid. The psychoid is an entity that we can't get at, but which has autonomous existence. But when we project our intuition of its existence onto it, it also projects its intuition of us, who it can't get at, onto us. And in the space between us, something forms. And that's both a synchronicity and a psychoid. And whether it explains things like UFOs and crop circles and subatomic particles or not, it's a stepping stone towards beginning to think about them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Richard, I'm glad you thought about me, and I thought about you, and we met at some point in time, and have continued to have these ongoing dialogues through our lives. Mean a lot to me. So we'll have you back on again sometime when Night Sky reemerges. Let's have a look at that, and we'll talk about it, okay?
Okay, thanks.
And early happy birthday to you, Richard.
Oh, thank you, yeah.
All right, take good care.
Soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. That's our friend, Richard Grossinger, not just any author, he's prolific. Check out his work, Richard Grossinger. You won't be disappointed. North Atlantic Books is his publishing company. I'm Robert Phoenix. You are you. Have a great weekend. I'll see you back here on Monday for the mashup. Here's Philip K. Dick.
We are living in a computer-programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed and some alteration in our reality occurs. We would have the overwhelming impression that we were reliving the present, déjà vu, perhaps in precisely the same way, hearing the same words, saying the same words. I submit that these impressions are valid and significant, and I will even say this: such an impression is a clue that at some past time point a variable was changed, reprogrammed as it were, and that because of this an alternative world branched off.